Welcome everyone to another edition of Play It Through, and for the first time ever, I am covering 3 games in one video, as we look at 3 different Star Wars games for the Atari 2600. Starting off, we're going to look at Star Wars the arcade game. Originally released in arcades in summer of 1983 and ported over to many home consoles, Star Wars the arcade game used vector graphics and was one of the coolest looking arcade games of the early 1980s. This home port for the Atari 2600 contains most of the gameplay, but of course the graphics have been greatly downgraded. But for its time, the game was actually able to pull off quite a lot for the old Atari 2600. In the game, we're playing as Luke Skywalker, blasting our way through TIE fighters, going through the Death Star trench, and eventually blowing up the Death Star itself. The game is broken up into 3 different sections, with the first one having us doing dogfighting with the various TIE fighters. The TIE fighters will blast at you, and as the blast gets closer, of course it'll grow in size, and you'll have to attack it with your lasers in order to get rid of it before it ends up getting too close. After only a few of the TIE fighters are defeated, we go to the second part, where you're dealing with these giant turret towers, having to not only dodge your way between the giant towers, but also blast the enemy fire that's coming towards you. You'll get a bonus if you're able to destroy a certain number of towers through the section, but your main goal is to avoid the turrets and try to maneuver your way through before you end up getting hit too many times. After traveling through the turret section for a little bit, we'll be moving on to the third and final section of the game, which has us actually inside of the Death Star trench. Your goal during this section is to travel through while dodging the enemy fire. You can blast at it for extra bonus points, and later difficulties add barriers and other obstacles that you're going to be having to dodge up and down while making your way through the trench. Your goal, of course, at the very end is to shoot the exhaust port in order to finally blow up the Death Star itself. You'll notice the exhaust port as a different looking object that lays on the floor. Once you shoot it, the Death Star explodes in a blast of Atari goodness before we go back to the first section of the game and continue battling the TIE fighters. Every time you complete a cycle of the game, things definitely get harder, with the blast that the TIE fighters are able to throw out being a lot quicker, as well as the amount of TIE fighters that you have to deal with. Now I'm going to play through the game one more time, showing you a little bit of the differences with the increased difficulty, and the more and more you play, the harder and harder the game gets. Like many Atari games, there's no real end goal, as your job is to just see how high of a score you can end up getting. The second time through the giant tower turret section is a lot harder, as it'll be harder to get in between and dodge around the various turret towers. This version of the Atari arcade game has a lot of nostalgia for me, as it was the first Star Wars game I actually ever played as a young kid. I would go over to my aunt's house, who was the only family member who had an Atari 2600 at that point, and had a variety of different games, including this one. After getting past the turret section, we now move on to the Death Star trench, and as you can see, it's a lot more difficult this time around, as we have to do a lot more dodging of up and down, watching out for the barriers that are coming our way. There are some projectiles still, which you can fire at for bonus points, but they move quicker, and because you're worried more about moving up and down, it's harder to see them actually coming towards you. But just like before, when you get near the end, shoot the exhaust port, and the Death Star will explode. We then head back and start the cycle once again, but we're going to move on now to our second Atari 2600 Star Wars game. Star Wars Empire Strikes Back for the 2600 has the distinction of being the very first Star Wars video game, and was released in 1982, with it being republished again in 1983. The game features only one scene, and that is the Battle of Hoth, when you're playing as Luke Skywalker in your snowspeeder, battling against the AT-ATs. So here we go. When you start off the game, you take off from the ground and start heading towards the blips on your map, representing the various AT-AT walkers. Your goal in the game is to destroy as many of the walkers as you possibly can before they end up reaching the rebel base. The thing about this game is, though, there is no ending to it. It's just you battling the AT-ATs until either you get destroyed 5 times, or they end up reaching the base. There is no way to prevent them from reaching Echo Base. So that pretty much ends up meaning your goal in the game is to see, well, how high of a score you can get. Now, each of the AT-AT walkers takes a large amount of hits for them to finally be destroyed. In fact, it's 48 total before one of them ends up going down. And you can move around and keep circling around the walker until it ends up firing at you and destroying you, or until you're able to take it out. As you're blasting at it, you'll notice that it will change colors, representing how much closer it is to being destroyed. It can fire behind and in front of it, so you have to do your best job that you can in order to avoid the various fire from the walker. Sometimes while playing, as you'll notice here, I'm flashing multiple colors. Apparently the Force takes over, and you're invulnerable for a short period of time. Like I said though, there is no way to actually win the game, and your eventual goal is just to destroy as many walkers as you can. They do have the instant destruction button though, as you may have noticed when I was flashing and all. Sometimes a little tiny piece will be exposed, and that will allow you to instantly take out one of the walkers if you're able to hit it before it ends up being covered back up. You can also mess with some of the difficulty switches, like many 2600 games, to make the game a little bit tougher, allow you to crash into the walkers instead of actually moving through them, as well as their overall speed. While the gameplay is very simplistic, it can be fun, especially if you compete against people to see who can get the high score, and it is the very first Star Wars game, so there is some leniency given to it, but the overall fun factor does start to wear thin after only a handful of minutes. Eventually, I usually end up just getting bored and let the walkers do their job and finish me off, and then continue their pathway over to the Echo Base. When your ship is destroyed, you'll respawn at the Echo Base and pick up right where the game was, so you'll see the walker that just destroyed you a few moments ago way off in the distance. But let's move on now to the third 2600 game that we're going to be covering in this episode. Star Wars Return of the Jedi Death Star Battle was actually one of two Return of the Jedi games being developed for the Atari 2600, with the other one being Ewok Adventure, which would have taken place on the planet of Endor, featuring the Ewok as a playable character, and even had you controlling an AT-ST. But unfortunately the game was cancelled, and only one version of the game is known to currently exist. Death Star Battle, of course, takes place during the second Death Star encounter, as we're playing as the Millennium Falcon, as we're trying to destroy, of course, the Death Star. The first section of the game starts you off, and you're below this weird floor, and you have to wait for openings in the floor and for the barrier to disappear so that you can fly through and go to the actual Death Star itself. Once there, you have to dodge a series of ships while firing up at the Death Star itself, reaching the core by breaking brick by brick. Once you deliver the blow to the core itself, it will start to flash, and pieces of it will start flying away as you'll have to dodge them as well, eventually exploding, giving you a big bonus of points, and then you're going back to the beginning and trying to get through the floor again. It's an extremely short experience, but it definitely gets more difficult the longer you play through it. Waiting for that opportunity to fly through the initial floor barrier can be pretty intense, as you have to wait for that right moment in order to fly through. This game is filled with flashing colors, and it's the kind of game that will completely light up a room if you have it on an old, big, giant TV. The section where you're destroying the bricks in order to get to the Death Star core itself is a little bit trickier, as well as you're trying to dodge all the other ships. I usually end up focused mostly just on the Death Star itself, instead of trying to battle the other stuff that's coming towards me. The first section, though, I'm kind of like usually rotating in the center, trying to shoot anything that may possibly get in my path before I have to make my way to one of those openings. You have a lot of leeway during the second section with the ships the way they're flying around, and usually you have plenty of time to just focus on the center and destroy the Death Star. Once you hit it though and it starts to flash, you're going to immediately want to try to get away because the blast will start coming towards you, and some of course move a lot quicker than others, as you can see. But there you go, that is Death Star Battle for the 2600. There was one more officially released Star Wars game for the 2600, Star Wars Jedi Arena, which is a 1 or 2 player experience, though I find it working best as a 2 player experience, and it's kind of like a weird game of Pong, with the training simulator that was seen in Star Wars A New Hope, each of you controlling a panel and trying to deflect electricity from the little flying device up at your opponent, eventually hitting them. Overall, it does take a lot to get used to, and I'm not the greatest at it, which is one of the reasons I'm not showcasing it in this video. But with that will wrap up this episode of Play It Through. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider giving it a thumbs up or commenting down below. Now, if you enjoyed this Atari 2600 Play It Through, be sure to check out my NES Star Wars I did a couple of weeks ago. Now, this is the final Play It Through for 2015, and 2016 is already shaping up to be a great year as I'm working on my bad games for January. I'm doing a new feature this year for February called Famicom February, only imports for the Japanese Famicom. March of Mega Man's returning. I'm also doing more May of Mario, blockbuster movie games for June and July, Ninja November, Disney December will be returning for next year, and of course horror games in the month of October. Now, of course, I also need to thank all the members of my Patreon. Without their continued support, I wouldn't be able to keep doing what I'm doing. You can help out as well. Just click the Patreon link down below for more details. Thank you, everybody, for making 2015 a great year for Cornshaq and the Cornshaq Nation. Thank you so much for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.